This car isn't worth the price of new tires.
The auction hall erupted in laughter as Charlotte Hayes, the 29-year-old billionaire queen of American supercar auctions, slid off her sunglasses and let the appraisal sheet fall onto the dusty hood of the old Mustang. Across from her stood Jake Miller, a single father from Arizona, hands stained with engine grease eyes, burning with the shame of a man who had nothing left to lose. But no one in that room noticed what Charlotte's eyes had locked onto seconds earlier, a hand-etched symbol beneath the rust, a mark she instantly recognized, and chose to lie about. 7 days later, the man she had humiliated would walk back into a room like this one and silence every single person inside it. The desert sun had not yet broken over the ridges east of Phoenix when Jake Miller stepped out into the gravel driveway and looked at the envelope still sitting on the passenger seat of his tow truck. He had not opened it. He didn't have to. The bank's logo in the corner told him everything, and the words on the front "Final Notice" had been burning in his peripheral vision for 2 days now. 7 days. That was what the letter said. 7 days before they came for the house. Behind him, the porch screen creaked. Emma stepped out in her socks, holding 2 slices of dry toast on a paper towel. She was 10 years old, with her mother's gray eyes and the kind of careful posture children develop when they've learned that someone in the house is always tired. "You forgot to eat again," she said, holding 1 slice up to him. Jake took it and ruffled her hair. "You're supposed to be asleep. You're supposed to be inside." He smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. 2 years had passed since the funeral, and there were still mornings he caught himself listening for footsteps that would never come down the hallway. The medical bills had outlived his wife by a long stretch. Between the hospital, the second mortgage, and the long stretches when his tow truck sat idle, the math had finally stopped pretending to add up. Inside the garage, under a faded canvas tarp, sat the only thing of value left in the Miller name. A 1967 Ford Mustang Shelby GT 500. Cherry red under the dust, though you had to squint to remember the color. It had belonged to Jake's father, Henry Miller, a quiet, broad-shouldered mechanic who had spent his best years bent over racing engines for a small team in California during the late 1960s. The old man had passed away 3 winters back, and the last clear thing he had ever said to his son, sitting on the edge of his hospital bed with an oxygen line under his nose, was a sentence that had never made full sense. "That car has a secret in it, Jake. When the time is right, it'll tell you." Jake had assumed it was the morphine talking. Now, with the foreclosure clock counting down, that car was the only chance left. A flyer had come through the mail a week earlier, a classic auto appraisal event in Las Vegas, hosted by Hayes Auctions, the most powerful name in American supercar trade. They were taking walk-in valuations for 2 days only. Jake had stared at the flyer for a long time before sliding it into his jacket pocket. He didn't want to sell the Mustang. He wanted to be the kind of father who never had to. He looked down at Emma, who was watching him too closely for a girl her age. "We're going for a drive today, kiddo," he said. "Long one." The Bellagio Hayes Auctions ballroom smelled of polished chrome and expensive cologne. Men in tailored sport coats moved between display lifts, where Ferraris and Porsches sat under directional spotlights. Jake felt the eyes on him the moment he rolled the Mustang in on the flatbed, a man in a faded denim jacket and oil-stained boots, holding the hand of a small girl who was clearly trying not to stare at the chandeliers. He had signed in under the public valuation line, a clipboard, a number, 47 people ahead of him. When his turn finally came, the floor went quiet, because the appraiser who walked out from behind the velvet rope was Charlotte Hayes herself. She was 29 years old and looked exactly like the magazine cover said she did. Tall, sharp-featured charcoal blazer, cut to follow a line that had been engineered rather than tailored. She had inherited the auction empire from her father 2 years earlier. And in those 2 years, she had become the most feared valuator in the country. Cars bowed when she walked past them. Collectors bid harder when she was in the room. She circled the Mustang once slowly. Her heels echoed on the polished concrete. Jake stood off to the side with Emma pressed close to his hip. Charlotte's gaze moved over the cracked vinyl roof, the rust blooms along the rear quarter, the dull paint. He saw her open her mouth and he braced for the verdict. Then her eyes dropped, just for a second, down toward the lower frame rail behind the front wheel well. Something there had caught her, something Jake could not see from where he was standing. Her expression did not change, but her body did. A pause in the rhythm of her steps, a small, careful inhale, and then, just as smoothly, she turned to face the audience that had gathered around the floor. Well, she slid her sunglasses off and tapped the appraisal sheet against the hood, raising a small cloud of dust. "I have to be honest with you, sir." Her voice carried the way a voice carries when it has been trained to carry. "This car isn't worth the price of new tires." A few chuckles rippled through the crowd. Charlotte gave a small, practiced smile. "I don't know how this one slipped through the door today, but I'll do you a favor. I'll have my office cut you a check for scrap weight. Maybe $4,000. Take your daughter to dinner." The laughter that followed was louder. It was the kind of laughter that did not come from amusement. It came from the relief of people who were grateful in that moment, not to be Jake Miller. Jake felt the heat climb up the back of his neck. He bent down to pick up Emma's backpack, ready to walk out of the building and never come back, ready to start drafting the letter that would tell the bank to come early and get it over with. Then Emma let go of his hand and stepped forward. She was small, and her sneakers squeaked once on the polished floor as she crossed half the distance between her father and the woman in the blazer. "You're lying," Emma said. The ballroom did not laugh this time. It went still in the way rooms go still when something unscripted has happened. Charlotte blinked once. "Excuse me." "You looked at the chassis number," the girl said. Her voice was clear, not loud, just clear. "When you walked around the front wheel, your eyes went down for a second and then you stopped breathing. My dad doesn't know what that means, but you do." Across the floor, somewhere in the back, near the security rope, an older man in a corduroy jacket lowered the coffee cup he had been raising to his lips. He had been watching the appraisal as a courtesy. Now he was watching it as a witness. Charlotte recovered fast. She always did. She gave the room a small laugh, the kind that suggested children would be children, and waved the moment off with the appraisal sheet. "Sweetheart, I think your father owes you a real conversation about how cars work." But the smile did not reach her eyes, and Jake, for the first time since he had walked into the building, felt something other than shame moving in his chest. He felt the small electric kick of a man who has just realized the dealer is shaving the deck. He took Emma's hand and walked her out of the ballroom without saying another word. The parking garage smelled of warm concrete and gasoline. Jake had just lifted Emma onto the bench seat of the tow truck when a voice spoke behind him. "Mr. Miller, a moment, please." The man in the corduroy jacket stood 10 paces back, hands held open at his sides so as not to startle. He was somewhere in his late 60s, silver hair clipped short, the deep tan of a man who had spent most of his life under hoods and under sunlight. "Name's Samuel Reed," he said. "I used to work in Venice, California, 1963 to 71. Shelby American." Jake felt the name settle in his stomach the way certain names do. "I saw what she did in there," Samuel continued, "and I saw what your little girl caught her doing. Smart kid." He nodded once toward Emma, then looked back at Jake. "I'd like to take a closer look at your car, outside away from cameras, if you'll let me." Jake hesitated, then nodded. Samuel walked around the Mustang slowly, the way a doctor walks around a patient he already suspects he understands. He crouched once, then a second time near the front wheel. Well, he ran his thumb along a hand-etched mark on the lower rail, something so worn down it looked almost like a scratch. When he stood back up, his face had changed. "Mr. Miller," he said quietly, "do you know what your father did for a living in 1968? He worked on race cars. Small team. He worked on more than that." Samuel's voice was steady, but there was something underneath it now, something close to reverence. "Shelby American built 3 experimental Mustangs that year. We called them Project Phoenix. They never went to market. The records say all 3 were destroyed in a warehouse fire in the summer of '68. He looked at the Mustang. 2 of them were. The 3rd one disappeared. Last seen on a transport truck heading toward Arizona, driven by a young mechanic whose name nobody at the company would ever say out loud again." Jake's hand tightened on the door handle. "My father. I'd bet my pension on it." Samuel exhaled. "The mark on your lower rail is the prototype stamp we used. Hand-etched. 3 men in the country today can still read it. I'm one of them. Charlotte Hayes, given who her father trained her under, is almost certainly another. What is it worth?" Samuel met his eyes. "At a real auction with proper documentation, $8 to $10 million. Jake felt the parking garage tilt half a degree. Emma behind him in the cab said nothing, but he could feel her listening. She knew Jake said. She knew when she walked up to it. She knew within 10 seconds. She lied within 20. "I've been around appraisers my whole life, son, and that was not a mistake in there. That was a setup." Samuel's mouth tightened. "She wanted you to take a scrap check and walk away. Whatever she had planned next was going to make her a great deal of money." Jake stood in the warm, concrete air and looked at the truck and the car and the small face of his daughter in the passenger window. 7 days. The bank letter on the dashboard. The Scottsdale auction at the end of the week, the largest classic car event in the country, where buyers who could afford $10 million Mustangs actually showed up. To get the car into Scottsdale, he would need to restore it, authenticate it, document it, defend it against people like Charlotte Hayes in 7 days, with no money. To not get the car into Scottsdale, he would have to sell it tomorrow at scrap and lose the house anyway. He felt Emma's hand slide into his through the open window. "Daddy," she said, "Grandpa told you the car had a secret. Maybe this is when it tells us." Jake closed his eyes for one long breath, then opened them and looked at Samuel Reed. "All right," he said. "Tell me what you need." Samuel almost smiled. "I need a clean garage, a phone, and a great deal of coffee." Jake nodded once and opened the driver's side door of the tow truck. The clock on the dashboard read 11:47 a.m. The 7 days had begun. The drive back to Phoenix took 4 hours and 40 minutes. Jake spent most of it in silence, hands at 10 and 2 on the wheel of the tow truck, the Mustang riding behind him on the flatbed, like something that had finally been allowed to come home. Samuel Reed followed in his own truck, a battered Ford pickup, with a toolbox bolted to the bed and a half-empty thermos rattling in the cup holder. Emma slept against the passenger door, her cheek smooshed against the window, her breath fogging a small circle on the glass. By the time the 3 of them rolled up the gravel driveway in the dry orange light of late afternoon, Jake had a plan only in the loosest sense of the word. He had a garage. He had a tarp full of memories. He had a man who could read marks that almost nobody else in the country could read. What he did not have was money for parts, money for tools beyond the ones his father had left him, or money for the kind of authentication paperwork that buyers at Scottsdale would demand before they raised a hand. So that night, after Emma had been put to bed, with her sneakers still on, Jake stood in the kitchen with his phone in his hand and called the only person in his life who had ever lent him money without asking when it was coming back. Danny Brooks had grown up 2 streets over from the Miller place. He owned a small auto body shop in Mesa now, and he answered on the 3rd ring with the particular kind of suspicion reserved for friends, who only call it strange hours. "Tell me nobody's hurt," Danny said. "Nobody's hurt." Jake leaned against the kitchen counter. "I need $8,000 by tomorrow morning, and I can't tell you what it's for until you say yes." There was a beat of silence on the other end. Then a long, slow exhale. You want it in cash or wired? Jake closed his eyes for a second. Cash. Garage by 7, Danny said. Don't make me regret this, Miller. Jake hung up and stared at the wall above the sink for a long time. His mother's old crucifix still hung there, dust-colored from years of sun. He did not pray exactly. He just stood very still until the kitchen clock ticked him back into himself. The next morning, the garage came alive, in a way it had not come alive since Henry Miller was still strong enough to stand at his own workbench. Samuel had laid out a list the night before, written in a careful slanted hand, on the back of a fast food napkin: gaskets, spark plugs, a new fuel pump, 2 specific rubber hoses that he insisted had to be sourced from a supplier he knew in Tucson, and a fresh battery. Danny's $8,000 in 20s was folded inside an envelope on the workbench, and by 10 o'clock, half of it was already gone. Emma appointed herself the project's archivist before anyone had asked. She came down the stairs in jeans and a faded NASA t-shirt, carrying a spiral notebook and the old Polaroid camera her grandfather had left in the hall closet. She walked around the Mustang the way her grandfather had once walked around it, pointing the camera at the lower rail of the engine bay, the vehicle identification plate under the dashboard, the hand-etched mark on the chassis that Samuel had circled with a piece of blue chalk. Every photo gets a number, she announced. Then I write what it is in the book. That way nobody can say we made anything up later. Samuel, who was wiping down the inside of the carburetor with a rag, looked up and gave her the closest thing to a real smile he had given anyone all day. Smart kid, he said again. Jake stayed late into the night. He stayed late into every night. He had not slept more than 4 hours at a stretch since the bank letter arrived, and he did not intend to start now. Somewhere between the second and third days, the cracked vinyl roof came off, the carpet came up, and the lower frame rail with its precious hand-etched mark was carefully cleaned and photographed from 6 different angles. Samuel walked Emma through what each line on the rail meant. Emma wrote it all down in her notebook. Jake watched them from across the garage and thought for the first time in 2 years that the house felt like a house again. 270 miles north, in a glass-walled office above the Las Vegas Strip, Charlotte Hayes had not been sleeping either. She stood at her window for a long time on the morning after the public valuation, watching the early traffic crawl along the boulevard below. Behind her on the desk was the appraisal sheet she had tapped against the Mustang's hood. She had not thrown it out. She had not been able to throw it out. The image of a 10-year-old girl saying, "You're lying," in a quiet, clear voice, had not left her since the moment it happened. What troubled her was not the embarrassment. Charlotte Hayes had been embarrassed in public before, and she had survived it. What troubled her was that she had, in fact, lied. She had recognized the mark on the lower rail in the time it took her to walk 3 steps. She had recognized what it meant within 5, and she had decided in the half-second before she opened her mouth to take a man who clearly needed money and shave him down to scrap weight so that she could buy the car herself through a shell account and resell it at her own house in 18 months for a fortune. That decision had felt in the moment like business. It did not feel like business now. She turned from the window and picked up her desk phone. The man who answered on the other end of the call was Richard Vance, and his voice came through the receiver, the way it always did, smooth, low, and patient in the way that snakes are patient. Vance owned 3 of the largest classic car collections in North America and a controlling interest in a media holding company that nobody outside the industry could trace back to him. He had been at war with the Hayes family for the better part of 20 years, ever since Charlotte's father had outbid him on a Cobra at a Pebble Beach auction and humiliated him in front of his second wife. The fact that Charlotte was calling him at all meant something had gone wrong. "I'm listening," Vance said. "There's a car," Charlotte said. "A 1967 Shelby. The owner is a man named Jake Miller in Phoenix. The car needs to leave his possession before the Scottsdale auction, and you can't acquire it yourself." There were complications. The line was quiet for a moment. "How complicated?" Vance said. "Complicated enough that you would do better acquiring it than I would. I'm prepared to make introductions. I'm prepared to make the path easier. In return, I expect the car to never appear on a public auction floor, under any house but mine." Richard Vance made a sound that might have been a laugh. "Charlotte," he said, "I have waited a very long time to hear you ask me for something." Her eyes closed. "I know." "I'll consider it," Vance said. "Send me what you have." The line clicked off, and Charlotte Hayes stood alone in her office and felt for the first time in a long time the cold, particular feeling of having stepped into something she would not be able to step back out of. By the morning of the fourth day, the Mustang's engine was almost ready to turn. Samuel had been on his back under the front end since sunrise, tightening the last of the fuel lines. Jake was at the workbench rebuilding the distributor by hand, because there was no money left for a new one, and Emma was sitting cross-legged on an overturned milk crate, reading aloud from her notebook to keep them both awake. "Photograph number 41, she said. "Lower frame, rail driver's side, hand-etched stamp. 3 small marks above a circle. Samuel says the circle means it was approved by a man named Carroll. He says the 3 marks mean it was the 3rd one." Samuel grunted from under the car. Carroll Shelby. And yes, at 10 minutes past 9 in the morning, Jake slid behind the wheel of the Mustang for the first time in 3 years. The seat leather had cracked in the heat of 2 Arizona summers, but it cradled him the way it had always cradled him, high in the shoulders, low at the hips. He set both hands on the wheel. Samuel stepped back. Emma raised the old phone she had borrowed from her father, set it to record, and gave him a small, serious nod. Jake turned the key. The engine did not catch on the first try. It did not catch on the second. On the third, somewhere deep inside the iron block his father had once disassembled and reassembled. With his own 2 hands, a heart began to beat. The pistons fired. The exhaust coughed once, twice, and then settled into a low, steady rumble that filled the garage and rolled out into the driveway and rattled the loose pane of glass in the side window. Emma did not lower the phone. She held it steady for almost a full minute, capturing the sound, the way the dust shook off the chrome trim, the way her father's hands gripped the wheel, and his shoulders dropped half an inch, as if a weight he had been carrying for years had finally been set down. That night, after Jake had fallen asleep at the kitchen table with his head on his arms, Emma sat in the living room with the phone in her lap, the porch light spilling through the window, and she did something her father had not asked her to do. She uploaded the video. She did not have many followers. She had a small account she used to share photos of model rockets and the occasional desert sunset. But she added a caption. "Grandpa said this car had a secret. Today, it started talking." And she added a single hashtag she had heard Samuel mutter under his breath 3 different times during the week. Hashtag Project Phoenix. She set the phone on the coffee table, turned off the light, and went upstairs to bed. By dawn, the video had been shared 11,000 times. By the time Jake came downstairs to make coffee, it was over 40,000. The comment thread underneath had been taken over by men with profile pictures of carburetors and racing helmets. "That's a hand-etched prototype stamp. That's a Phoenix car, I'd bet my house on it. Somebody get this in front of Shelby American Heritage before it disappears again." Jake stood in his own kitchen with a phone he had not touched and watched his life turn over in real time. The Blacktown car arrived at the gravel driveway at 11 o'clock that same morning. Charlotte Hayes stepped out of the back seat in a different blazer, this time a quieter one, and without sunglasses. She crossed the gravel slowly, the way someone crosses ground that is not their own. Jake was already out of the garage by the time she reached the porch steps, wiping grease from his hands onto a shop rag. "Mr. Miller," she said. "Miss Hayes." The civility between them was paper thin. They both knew it. "I'd like to make you an offer," she said. "A real one this time. $4 million. Cash. Cleared into your account before sundown. I'll handle the certification, the press, the buyers. You walk away today. You save the house. You set your daughter up for college, and you never have to stand on a Scottsdale auction floor and watch men with more money than you bid against each other for your father's car. Jake folded the shop rack and put it in his back pocket. $4 million, he said. Cash. Real market value given the certification work that's left to do. Yes. He looked at her for a long moment, and she did not look away. He noticed that her hands were not quite steady at her sides. My father kept this car for 40 years, Jake said. He kept it through 3 jobs and 2 surgeries, and the year my mother was sick. He never sold it. He never came close to selling it. And on his last day, he told me the car had a secret, and that one day it would tell me what it was. He looked past her at the desert ridge in the distance. 4 days ago, you stood in front of a room full of people, and you called it scrap. You let them laugh at me. You let them laugh at her. He nodded once toward the kitchen window where Emma was watching from behind the curtain. I'm not selling my father's car to the woman who tried to steal it from us in public. Not for $4 million. Not for 40. Charlotte Hayes had been told no in her life before. She had been told no by senators, by oil money, by men who had owned their cars for 30 years and refused to part with them. She had always understood why. She had always been able to respect it. This was the first time in her career that being told no had made her feel small. I understand, she said quietly. She turned and walked back to the town car. She did not look back. The gravel crunched once under her heels at the door, and then she was inside, and then the car was gone. Jake stood on the porch for a long time afterward, looking down the empty road. In the kitchen, Emma let the curtain fall. The break-in happened on the night of the 5th day. Jake had locked the garage at midnight the same way he locked it every night. The Mustang was inside under its tarp. Emma's notebook of photographs and Samuel's authentication notes were inside a steel toolbox on the workbench. The wooden cigar box that Henry Miller had used to keep receipts and pink slips for 40 years was sitting beside it untouched. At 2:17 in the morning, somebody cut the side lock with a battery-powered grinder. The security camera on the corner of the garage caught the back of a man's head and the sleeve of a black canvas jacket and nothing else. Whoever it was knew exactly what to take. The notebook, the folder of Samuel's notes, the vehicle title from the workbench drawer, the Polaroid photographs from the wall corkboard. They didn't touch the car. Jake walked into the garage at 6:30 in the morning and stopped in the doorway. The tarp was still on the Mustang. The toolbox was on the floor, open and empty. The workbench corkboard had been swept clean. By 7, he had called the sheriff. By 8, a deputy had taken a report and told him with the gentle professionalism of a man who had given the same speech 100 times that the chances of recovering the documents were low. At 9, Samuel arrived and looked at the empty bench and said only one word. Vance. Jake looked at him. Who Richard Vance? There are 3 people in the country who would have known what to take from this garage, son. I'm one of them. Charlotte Hayes is another. Vance is the 3rd. He's the only one who would have done it like this. By 10 o'clock that same morning, a cable news segment ran on a small, classic car channel that broadcast out of Dallas. A man in a gray suit, introduced as a senior automotive historian, sat in front of a bookshelf and explained calmly and at length that the so-called Project Phoenix Mustang, circulating on social media, appeared to be a fabrication. The chassis stamp he claimed had been replicated using a technique developed in the mid-1990s. Without original documentation, no responsible auction house could allow such a vehicle on a sale floor. The channel ran the segment 3 times that day. By noon, 2 of the 4 collectors who had reached out about the Scottsdale auction had quietly withdrawn their interest. By 3, the Scottsdale auction house itself had called Jake's number and left a voicemail explaining with deep regret that without certified provenance documentation in hand by 6 o'clock the following evening, the Mustang would have to be removed from the catalog. Emma cried that night for the first time since the funeral. Jake sat on the edge of her bed and did not have anything to say. By the morning of the 6th day, Jake had Richard Vance's phone number on a slip of paper in his hand. The number had come through a contact of Samuel's. Vance had let it be known through that contact that he was prepared to take the Mustang off Jake's hands today. Sight unseen, no certification required, for $1,200,000. It was not enough to make Jake a wealthy man. It was enough to clear the medical debt. It was enough to pay off the mortgage. It was enough to keep Emma in the school district she had known since kindergarten. Jake stood in the kitchen with the phone in his hand and his thumb hovering over the number, and he understood very calmly that he was about to lose this fight. Emma came down the stairs. She was holding the wooden cigar box from the workbench, the one the thief had left behind, the one Jake had not opened in 2 years because looking at his father's old handwriting was still on, some mornings more than he could carry. "Daddy," she said, "Grandpa told you the car would tell us its secret when the time was right. I think the time is now." Jake set the phone on the counter. Emma climbed onto the kitchen chair beside him and lifted the lid of the cigar box. Inside, beneath a stack of yellowed receipts and a faded matchbook from a diner in Bakersfield, was a small, flat object wrapped in oilcloth. She unwrapped it carefully. It was a thin metal plate the size of a playing card with a serial number stamped into it. Above the serial number in his father's careful handwriting were 3 words. "If they come." Underneath the plate was a black and white photograph. 2 young men leaning against the open hood of a Mustang in a sunlit garage. One of them was a much younger Henry Miller. The other was unmistakably Carroll Shelby's lead test driver of 1968, a man named Michael Turner, who had died in a single-car accident on a highway outside Bakersfield in 1971. The serial number on the plate matched the hand-etched stamp on the Mustang's lower rail. Jake sat down in the kitchen chair. The cigar box, the matchbook, the plate, the photograph, his father's handwriting. If they come. He had been waiting for the secret his whole life, and the secret had been 6 feet from him in a wooden box that whole time. The doorbell rang. Jake looked up. Through the front window in the gravel driveway under the late morning sun was the same black town car. Charlotte Hayes stood beside it, holding a thick manila envelope under one arm. She did not look like a woman who had come to buy anything. She looked like a woman who had not slept. When Jake opened the door, she did not wait for him to speak. "I'm not here for the car," she said. "I have spent the last 48 hours in our company archive in Los Angeles. My father kept files on every prototype Shelby ever produced. I have brought you copies of every original record on Project Phoenix that exists in the Hayes family vault." She held the envelope out. "I am not asking for forgiveness. I am asking for one chance to help you walk into Scottsdale tomorrow with paperwork nobody in that room can argue with." Jake looked at the envelope. He looked at the woman holding it. He thought about his daughter behind him in the kitchen and the wooden box on the counter and the plate inside it that read, "If they come." He stepped aside and held the door open. "Come in," he said. Charlotte sat at the kitchen table for almost a full minute before she spoke. The manila envelope rested in front of her, unopened, the corners of it slightly bent from being carried under her arm through 3 airports and 1 rental car. Jake stood across from her with his arms folded. Samuel had come in from the garage and was leaning against the doorframe with a coffee cup in his hand, saying nothing. Emma sat on the second stair just out of sight, listening. "Before I open this," Charlotte said, "I owe you the truth. All of it. And then you decide whether you want my help." Jake nodded once. I knew what the car was the second I saw it. Her voice was steady, but her eyes were not. I knew because my father trained me to read those marks before I was old enough to drive. When I walked up to the Mustang in Las Vegas, I made a choice in less than 10 seconds. I decided to call it scrap. I was going to buy it from you through a shell company for under $5,000, hold it for 18 months, and resell it through my own house for somewhere between 8 and 10 million. Samuel set his cup down very quietly on the counter. "After your daughter called me out," I knew I'd lost the chance to do it cleanly. So I called Richard Vance. Charlotte met Jake's eyes and didn't look away. I told him about the car. I told him you would be vulnerable. I made the path easier for him. I did not order the break-in. I did not tell him to plant a fake historian on cable. But I made it possible. I am the reason he knew where to look. Jake's jaw tightened. His hands folded across his chest, curled into fists against his ribs. He took a breath in, and Samuel, reading him, straightened against the doorframe in case he needed to step in. "Get out of my house," Jake said. The words came low, almost gentle, which was worse than if he had shouted them. Charlotte did not move. "You can throw me out," she said. "You'd be right to. But there is no one else in the country who can do for you in the next 30 hours what I can do. There are 2 people Scottsdale will accept verification from on no notice. One of them is on a yacht in the Mediterranean. The other one is sitting at your kitchen table. Daddy." The voice came from the stairs. Emma stepped down into the kitchen holding the wooden cigar box in both hands. She set it on the table beside the envelope. She did not look at Charlotte. She looked at her father. Grandpa wrote, "If they come on that plate," she said. He didn't write "if the nice ones come." He just wrote, "if they come." He knew somebody was going to try to take it. He knew somebody was going to lie about it. He left us what we needed to fight back. Her gray eyes, her mother's eyes, held her father's. She did a bad thing. She's the only one left who can help us undo it. Grandpa would have used her. Jake stood very still in the middle of his own kitchen. He looked at his daughter, and at the cigar box, and at the woman in the chair, who had not moved since she sat down, and at the clock above the stove, which read 11:40 in the morning. 30 hours, give or take, until the Scottsdale floor opened. He unfolded his arms. "You work in the garage," he said to Charlotte. "Not in this house." "Samuel runs the room. You answer his questions, you don't ask your own. If you lie to me one more time, I throw you out, and I take my chances with Vance's offer. Are we clear?" Open the envelope. What came out of the envelope took Samuel Reed almost an hour to fully read. There were build sheets hand-typed on the original Shelby American letterhead, listing all 3 Project Phoenix prototypes by chassis, number, engine, block number, and assigned test driver. There were memos between Carroll Shelby and a Ford engineering office in Dearborn dated June of 1968, discussing the discontinuation of the program and the proposed destruction of all 3 vehicles. There was a transport manifest, partially blacked out, half faded, for a single covered trailer dispatched from Venice, California, on the 18th of August, 1968 destination, listed only as Southern Arizona Private Storage. The driver's name on the manifest had been struck through with a pen, but the handwriting underneath it was still legible to a careful eye. H. Miller. Samuel laid the manifest down on the workbench in the garage and looked at Jake for a long moment. "Your father drove this car out of the warehouse the day before the fire," he said. "He saved it. That's what these papers prove, combined with the plate from the cigar box, combined with the chassis stamp, combined with the photograph of him and Michael Turner. There isn't a court of provenance in this country that can rule against you tomorrow." "It's not a court," Jake said. "It's an auction house." "It's better than a court," Charlotte said quietly from the corner of the garage, where she had been standing in silence for over an hour. "Courts care about law. Auction houses care about the room. And tomorrow, the room is going to be on your side." Jake looked at her. He did not yet trust her. He was not sure he was ever going to fully trust her. But she was working, and she was right. By 2 in the afternoon, Charlotte was on the phone with 2 senior authenticators from the Shelby American Heritage Foundation, both of whom she had known personally since she was a teenager. By 4, she had a private jet arranged to fly them out of Los Angeles that evening on her own personal account, with no expectation of reimbursement. By 6, the Scottsdale auction house had received a formal request from Hayes Auctions, signed by Charlotte herself, to delay the catalog cutoff for the Miller Mustang by 12 hours, citing a personal guarantee of provenance from her own house. The request was granted within 15 minutes. Somewhere between the calls and the paperwork, Charlotte stepped out into the driveway to take one more call. She did not announce who she was calling. She did not need to. The man on the other end of the line was a private collector in Tokyo, an old client her father had introduced to the Hayes house in 2019, a man with both the money to play at the very top of the market and an old grudge of his own against Richard Vance. The call lasted 12 minutes. When Charlotte came back into the garage, she did not say a word about it. She only nodded once at Jake and went back to the paperwork. By midnight, the two heritage authenticators were standing in Jake's garage under the work lights, running a magnifier over the lower rail. They examined the chassis stamp. They cross-referenced the plate from the cigar box. They walked Samuel through every step of his own findings, line by line, asking questions only men who had been on the original Shelby floor in 1968 could have asked. Samuel answered every one of them. The older of the two authenticators, a soft-spoken man in his early 70s, whose hands had not stopped shaking gently since he had walked into the room, finally lowered his magnifier and looked at Samuel for a long moment. "You've known what this car is for 6 days, haven't you?" he said. "I've been 99% sure for 6 days," Samuel said. "One man's word isn't enough at Scottsdale. That's why you're here." The authenticator nodded slowly. He turned to the second man, who had not spoken once all night. The second man set his own magnifier down on the workbench and said simply, "It's real." The Mustang was authenticated. At 3:15 in the morning, the Scottsdale auction house received a final certification packet, signed and sealed by both heritage authenticators, transmitted directly from Charlotte's encrypted office line. The Mustang was reinstated to the catalog as the headline lot of the morning session. Jake stood in the garage doorway as the heritage men packed their cases. The desert was very quiet behind him. Emma was asleep on the workbench bench, curled under his jacket. Samuel was sweeping the floor by hand for something to do with himself. Charlotte came up beside Jake and did not speak for a moment. "I'll be at the auction tomorrow," she said finally. "I won't sit with you. That isn't my place. But I'll be in the room. If anyone tries to challenge the paperwork from the floor, I'll stand up. Vance won't expect that." Jake nodded, his eyes on the horizon. "Why are you doing this?" he asked. "The real reason." She looked at the Mustang under the work lights for a long time before she answered. "Because the only person who has ever told me the truth to my face in public was your 10-year-old daughter," she said. "And I would like before I die to deserve it." The Scottsdale auction floor at 10 o'clock the next morning was the largest single gathering of classic car money in the United States. Men in tailored linen jackets sat in folding chairs under an enormous white tent. Bitter paddles rested on knees. Spotlights crossed the polished concrete. A coffee cart in the corner had been busy since 6. Jake stood at the edge of the staging area in his cleanest button-down shirt and the only pair of leather shoes he owned. Emma stood beside him in a navy dress she had picked out herself that morning. Samuel was 3 steps behind them, hat in his hands. The Mustang sat on the staging ramp, restored, polished the cherry red of its paint, deep and alive under the morning sun. The hand-etched mark on the lower rail had been left uncleaned by deliberate choice. In the front row of the audience, exactly where Charlotte had said he would be, sat Richard Vance. Gray suit, silver hair, a bitter paddle resting on his right knee. He had not looked once toward Jake. He did not need to. He was a man who had decided how the morning was going to go and was waiting for the room to agree with him. Charlotte sat 10 rows back in a black blazer alone. The auctioneer took the microphone. "Ladies and gentlemen, our headline. Lot of the morning. Lot number 114. A 1967 Ford Mustang Shelby GT 500 with formal authentication on file as one of the 3 Project Phoenix prototypes, built by Shelby American in 1968. Provenance documents have been verified overnight by the Shelby American Heritage Foundation and certified by Hayes Auctions. We'll open the bidding at $1 million. The room shifted the way a large body of water shifts when something heavy drops into it. The first paddle went up at 1 million. The second came at 1.2. By 1.54 paddles were active. By 2 million, the action had narrowed to 3 serious bidders. By 3, it was down to 2, a collector calling in from Dallas on a telephone line, and Richard Vance, who was raising his paddle without expression every time the auctioneer called a new number. At 4 million, the Dallas line dropped out. The auctioneer looked across the room. $4 million to the gentleman in the front row. Do I have 4.5? A new paddle went up at the back of the tent. A representative of a private trust nobody in the room recognized. 4.5. Do I have 5? Vance lifted his paddle. 5 million. Do I have 5.5? The trust representative raised again. 5.5. 6. Vance again. No expression. No hesitation. The numbers climbed. 6. 6.5. 7. The trust representative dropped out at 7.2. Vance held at 7.5. $7,500,000, the auctioneer said, to the gentleman in the front row. Fair warning. Do I hear 7.6, 7.6, anywhere in the room? The tent went quiet. Vance, for the first time, allowed himself a small, tight smile. The auctioneer raised the gavel. Going once at 7,500,000, EBOTY phone rang. It rang from a bidding desk on the far right side of the tent, one of the international call-in stations. The desk operator, a young woman in a headset, raised her hand sharply into the air. New bidder on the line, she called out. $8 million. The tent did not gasp. It did something quieter than that. The air seemed to leave it for a moment, and then come back at a slightly different temperature. The auctioneer's eyebrows lifted, and a slow professional grin spread across his face. $8 million from the telephone. Sir, do I hear 8.1? Every head in the room turned to Richard Vance. Vance sat very still, his mouth pressed into a thin line. He leaned over and spoke a single quiet sentence to the lawyer seated to his left, and the lawyer leaned in and whispered something back that took the better part of half a minute. Across the tent, Charlotte Hayes was no longer in the 10th row. She was standing at the back of the tent now, near the press desk, and the manila folder under her arm was new, thicker than the one she had brought to Jake's kitchen, and stamped on the corner with the seal of a federal records office. Vance's lawyer kept whispering. Vance's jaw moved once very tightly. There were 4 men in that tent who had been on Vance's payroll in the past 18 months, and Vance knew, watching Charlotte stand at the press desk with that folder, that any further bid from him on this car would be the bid that brought the question of provenance interference into a federal courtroom. He had walked into Scottsdale willing to spend $8, $9, $10 million to win. He had not walked in willing to spend the rest of his career defending the way he had tried to win. He lowered his paddle slowly to his knee. Going once at $8 million. Going twice. Sold. The gavel came down to the bidder on the telephone for $8 million. The tent stood up. Jake did not hear the applause at first. He heard a high ringing sound in his ears, and then he heard Emma laughing, and then he felt his daughter's arms around his waist, and then the world came back to him in pieces. Samuel was wiping his face with the back of his hand and pretending he was not. Across the tent, Charlotte was clapping with the rest of them, but she was looking at Jake the entire time. Richard Vance set his paddle down on his empty chair and walked out of the tent without a word. The Mustang was loaded onto a covered transport that afternoon and shipped to a private climate-controlled garage in Northern California on its way to its new owner overseas. Jake stayed in Scottsdale long enough to sign the paperwork and shake the hands of 3 different men, whose names he forgot before they had finished introducing themselves. Then he drove home in the tow truck, with Emma asleep against his arm, and Samuel in the passenger seat, and the desert in front of them turning the same red the Mustang had been. The medical debt was paid by the end of the following week. The mortgage was paid off 3 days after that. The foreclosure file at the bank was closed by a clerk who, by her own account, had never closed a file like it before. The remainder went into a college account in Emma's name and into a savings account Jake did not touch, and into the renovation of his father's old garage. Danny Brooks got his $8,000 back the same afternoon. Jake came home from Scottsdale in the same envelope with an extra $60,000 on top of it, and a handwritten note that read, "Only for believing." Danny tried 3 different times across the following month to give the $60,000 back. Jake refused him every time. By the end of that month, Danny had agreed to come on as a partner in the new garage. The garage opened 6 months later under a new sign: Miller and Father Classic Restoration. The sign was hand-painted by a friend of Samuel's from Tucson. Samuel himself was listed on the door as senior consultant. He did not draw a salary. He did not need to. He had not been this happy in 20 years. Emma went back to her school in the same school district. She started spending Saturdays at the garage in coveralls, 2 sizes too big for her, learning to read engines from a man who had once read them for Carroll Shelby. Her grades did not slip. Her teachers on parent-teacher nights told Jake that his daughter had a kind of focus they did not often see in children. Charlotte Hayes did not step down as chief executive of Hayes Auctions. She did, however, announce 6 weeks after Scottsdale the founding of a small nonprofit attached to her house, a foundation whose stated purpose was to provide free independent provenance authentication for families who had inherited classic American vehicles, so that no working family would ever again walk into an auction floor and be lied to in public. The foundation's first board member, listed at the bottom of the press release, was Samuel Reed. Richard Vance was investigated 4 months later by federal authorities after the security camera footage from Jake's garage was matched through a different and unrelated case to a man on Vance's private payroll. Vance himself was never formally charged, but 3 of his largest auction relationships quietly ended, and his name stopped appearing in the front rows of the tents. The last evening of that first summer in the new garage, the sun went down over the ridges east of Phoenix, the same way it had gone down on the morning the bank letter came. Red and slow and very large. Jake stood on the gravel in front of the open bay door. Emma was beside him in jeans and a grease-streaked t-shirt. Samuel was inside locking up the back office. A car came up the road. It was a flatbed, smaller than Jake's tow truck, driven by a delivery service Jake did not recognize. It pulled up to the front of the garage and stopped. Charlotte Hayes climbed out of the passenger side in jeans and a denim jacket. She had not been to the house since the day after the auction. On the flatbed under the early evening sun sat the Mustang, cherry red, restored. The hand-etched mark on the lower rail still visible deliberately left untouched. Charlotte walked across the gravel and held out a single key on a worn leather fob. "It took 6 months," she said. "The buyer in Tokyo turned out to be a man with a sense of humor. He owns the title on paper. He's loaned it back to your family for the rest of his life, and the rest of yours, and the rest of hers." She glanced at Emma. "He said a Phoenix car belongs in Phoenix." Jake did not take the key right away. He looked at her, really looked at her. For the first time since the morning in the kitchen. "The day I met you," Charlotte said, "I looked at this car, and I saw a number. Your father looked at it and saw a promise he made to somebody a long time ago. It took me 7 days to learn how to see what he saw. I'm still learning." She held the key out a little further. Jake took it. He turned to his daughter, who had grown almost an inch since the morning of the bank letter, and who was already watching the Mustang the way her grandfather had once watched it. "Em," he said, "you start it." Emma climbed up onto the flatbed. She crossed to the driver's side and slid in behind the wheel. She set both hands on it, the way she had watched her father do it in the garage on the 4th morning. She turned the key. The engine caught on the first try. The low, steady rumble rolled out across the gravel, across the open desert, across the ridges, turning red in the falling sun. 3 people stood at the front of a garage with a hand-painted sign over the bay door. None of them said anything for a long time. The car had told its secret. The right people had been listening.